The story begins not with statistics or charts, but with a quiet moment where the world splits into two paths. Imagine standing on a line that divides a country, where the soil looks the same on both sides, the air carries the same weight, and the sky pulls the same light across the horizon. Yet one side hums with the sound of steady work, quiet ambition, and the slow confidence of people building their lives. The other side feels heavier, as if the ground itself has grown cautious, waiting for permission before allowing anything to change. This invisible fracture between possibility and stagnation is where the narrative of nations rising and nations collapsing begins, and it reveals something deeper than geography or luck, the architecture of power shaping ordinary lives. You can picture the people on the prosperous side waking early, stepping into days where effort has meaning. They know that if they start a business, no official will seize it on a whim. If they learn a skill, no authority will forbid them from using it. If they dream, the system will not punish them for imagining a future larger than their assigned place. Their confidence is quiet but steady because the rules they live under allow for growth, innovation, and the unpredictable spark of human creativity. The streets reflect this energy, students moving with notebooks pressed to their arms, shopkeepers lifting shutters at dawn, ideas passing between strangers with the ease of warm air drifting through open windows. Across the line, in the shadowed half of the same land, people carry a different rhythm in their bodies. They walk with slower steps as if listening for something before speaking. Their dreams shrink into manageable sizes, cautious enough to survive. A man may know how to repair radios, but he will not open a shop because the officials who control the permits demand loyalty instead of effort. A young woman with sharp intelligence might never attend school because the powerful prefer obedience over talent. The system does not bend toward their hopes. Instead, it presses down with the weight of someone else's interests. Even the quiet conversations in kitchens carry an edge of resignation, as if everyone understands that the future is already claimed by hands they will never see. This contrast, subtle yet overwhelming, lays the emotional foundation for the book's central truth. Nations fail not because of their landscapes or histories, but because their institutions choose winners before the race begins. It is not the soil that determines destiny. It is the rules of the world woven into every life the moment a child takes their first breath. When power is locked in the grip of a select few, every door becomes a gatekeeping tool, and every opportunity becomes a privilege rationed out in whispers. When power is shared, when systems welcome participation rather than fear it, a nation breathes differently. Hope does not feel dangerous. Change does not require permission. In this opening understanding, we feel the emotional weight of what inclusive institutions truly mean. They are not academic constructs but the lived experience of a person knowing that effort will not be betrayed. They allow towns to grow from markets to cities, allow invention to rise from curiosity to industry, and allow ordinary people to become the heartbeat of national prosperity. Their strength lies not in perfection but in openness, a willingness to let new voices influence the direction of the nation and to protect individuals from being devoured by unpredictable whims of powerful men. On the other side, extractive institutions are not merely unfair rules. They are constraints stitched into everyday life, creating an emotional environment where innovation becomes reckless and ambition becomes a liability. People learn to stay small because smallness is safer. Leaders remain suspicious of progress because progress threatens the narrow towers they stand on. Time in these places feels thick, unmoving, as if every year repeats the previous one with only minor variations. Another official gaining wealth, another community losing rights, another bright mind slipping into silence. As the story moves deeper, we begin to understand that nations do not drift randomly into wealth or poverty. They are pulled by the gravity of their political structures, shaped by decisions made long ago, decisions that echo through generations in the form of opportunities offered or denied. The narrative invites us to feel the human heartbeat behind economic theories, to witness how laws translate into emotions, choices, and the quiet erosion or strengthening of hope. And from this emotional landscape, the journey expands, carrying us toward places where these two paths, the open and the closed, collide in dramatic, unforgettable ways, revealing how a simple difference in the structure of power can split the destiny of millions. The contrast becomes even more vivid when the story takes us to one of the most striking real-world mirrors of this divide, the Korean Peninsula. Standing at its border feels like standing at the edge of two different timelines. The mountains roll in similar shapes, the seasons brush the land with the same hands, and the people share centuries of history, language, and ancestry. Yet the atmosphere carries two entirely different emotions. On one side, there is the hum of electricity from street lamps glowing long after midnight, the faint aroma of late-night food stalls, the quiet determination of a society that has decided to race toward possibility. On the other, there is a darkness that settles heavily, a stillness broken only by the strict patterns of state-controlled movement, as if life is unfolding behind a veil that nobody is allowed to touch. South Korea breathes with the rhythm of a society where effort can change a life. A young engineer can refine an idea late into the night, confident that if the idea grows strong enough, investors will appear and no unseen authority will steal it. Cafes buzz with students who believe that knowledge will open doors rather than lock them into predetermined roles. Even the simplest street corner carries the energy of a place where someone might fail today, try again tomorrow, and eventually create something that transforms their future. This freedom, subtle but powerful, forms the emotional core of inclusive institutions, a sense that the future is not predetermined, that the system welcomes movement rather than fearing it. North Korea, however, exists under a different emotional gravity. People carry a practiced silence in their gestures, as if every thought must be sifted before it reaches the air. A farmer may look across the same soil that feeds families in the South yet know that whatever he grows does not fully belong to him. A student may excel in her studies yet remain confined because the structure of power values loyalty above talent. Life feels curated by distant hands, and even the act of imagining a different future becomes an internal rebellion. Here, institutions limit not just wealth but imagination itself. This split, carved across a single people, offers one of the clearest emotional illustrations of the book's central message. What determines prosperity is not culture or climate, but the way a society shapes power. The difference between these two Koreas is not centuries of separation but the nature of the institutions each side chose, or had forced upon them. One welcomed participation, the other feared it. One allowed creativity, the other controlled it. One celebrated the unpredictability of human potential, the other treated it as a threat. As we move deeper into the story, this theme repeats through history with haunting clarity. The success of a nation is not a straight line but a fragile balance, shaped by moments when societies either open their systems or tighten them. The emotional tension lies in how small these moments often appear, how quietly they unfold in rooms where a handful of leaders decide whether new ideas will be invited in or shut out. These decisions ripple outward, touching generations that will never know the names of the people who made them. The narrative now begins to widen its scope, preparing to explore how these patterns played out across continents and centuries, and how the struggle over institutions, over who gets to decide the rules and who gets to live under them, became the hidden engine of the rise and fall of nations. The story widens across the map, drifting from the Korean peninsula to the long stretch of land that once held another dramatic divide, the border between Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora. If someone stood at that boundary fence in the early morning light, they would see houses clustered on both sides, narrow roads weaving up modest hills, families preparing breakfast and children getting ready for school. The sunlight touches both towns with the same warm glow, yet the atmosphere feels different, almost as if the air itself carries a separate history on each side. On the northern side, the streets feel orderly not because life is perfect, but because people move through a system they believe is designed to protect them. On the southern side, the buildings reveal scars of underinvestment, and the rhythm of daily life holds a quieter wariness, shaped by the uncertainty that shadows many choices. It becomes clear that geography alone cannot explain why two halves of one community experience such different realities. People on the northern side can walk into government offices without bribing anyone to be heard, can start small businesses without fearing that a local official will seize them, and can rely on police who, despite imperfections, are expected to uphold rights rather than bargain them away. Children grow up believing that if they study and work hard, the world may give something back. Their parents hold long-term plans in their minds, buying a home, saving for college, opening a shop, and those plans feel achievable even if difficult. Just a few steps south, people carry a different emotional blueprint. They may work just as hard, dream just as widely, but the system often turns their effort into a fragile gamble. A shopkeeper might worry that protection payments will swallow whatever profit she earns. A young man might take a job knowing that a political shift or a powerful neighbor could make his position vanish without explanation. Trust becomes something people reserve for family and close friends, because institutions do not always act as guardians of fairness. The mood here is not despair but caution, a kind of vigilant hope that tries to grow in unfriendly soil. This contrast does not come from culture or character. It springs from the structure of the institutions that govern each side. The northern half functions within an inclusive system where rules apply broadly, and rights are not easily stripped away. The southern half functions within a more extractive framework, where those in power often treat resources, opportunities, and even public offices as personal possessions. No amount of sunlight or shared ancestry can bridge that divide. What shapes prosperity is not the land, but the way power flows through society, and who has the right to use their potential freely. The emotional weight of this comparison deepens when we think about how easily these two Nogaleses could have mirrored each other's fate if history had unfolded differently. A single political decision made decades earlier, a shift in colonial administration, a rebellion crushed, or a constitution rewritten. Each of these could have drawn the border in a different direction emotionally, even if the physical line stayed the same. Power leaves fingerprints across generations, and those fingerprints become visible in the choices ordinary people are allowed to make each day. From here, the narrative steps deeper into the past, exploring how the roots of inclusive and extractive systems formed long before modern borders existed. It looks at how powerful elites in some societies built institutions to secure their dominance, creating cycles where opportunity remained a privilege for the few. In other places, conflict, negotiation, and unexpected historical shocks opened cracks in the walls of inequality, allowing broader participation and creating room for innovation to flourish. These moments were rarely peaceful or predictable. They came from revolutions, from desperate gambles by leaders, from ordinary people refusing to accept silence as their fate. As the story continues, the emotional arc turns toward one of the most extraordinary historical transformations, the shift in England that opened the door to the modern world. This transformation did not happen because England was somehow destined for greatness. It happened because centuries of conflict, tension, and bargaining eventually created a political environment where institutions began to protect individuals from the unchecked power of the state. And that shift, subtle at first, then unstoppable, became the spark that would ignite an age of innovation that reshaped the planet. The journey now moves through time to a moment when England itself was wrapped in uncertainty. Imagine walking down a cobblestone street in the early 17th century, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Merchants call out their prices, apprentices rush between workshops, and the distant bells of a church tower echo through narrow lanes. Beneath the everyday noise lies an undercurrent of tension, because people are beginning to question the authority that has ruled them for generations. The monarchy stands tall, but cracks are forming in the foundation of unquestioned power. Parliament is gaining confidence, merchants are gaining wealth, and ordinary people are learning that their voices might carry weight beyond their neighborhoods. This was not a peaceful negotiation. It was a slow, grinding collision of interests that stretched across decades. Kings wanted to strengthen their authority, believing stability depended on centralized control. But merchants and landowners, growing richer through expanding trade, resisted the king's attempts to squeeze more revenue from them. They wanted predictable rules, not the shifting demands of a sovereign desperate to maintain his grip. As the monarchy tried to impose its will, Parliament pushed back. Each side believed it fought for the soul of the nation, yet beneath their conflict lay a deeper struggle, the fight over whether power would remain concentrated or begin to spread. The tension erupted into open conflict during the English Civil War. Streets that once bustled with trade now echoed with the heavy steps of soldiers. Families were divided by loyalties, conversations whispered in fear of eavesdropping neighbors. The outcome of this struggle was far more than a political reshuffling. When the monarchy was temporarily dismantled, it sent a shock through the entire system, proving that even the most entrenched authority could be broken. And when the monarchy eventually returned, it did so weakened, unable to rule with the same absolute certainty it once commanded. The emotional climax of this long struggle arrived with the Glorious Revolution of 1688. It was not a glorious event for everyone involved. Revolutions rarely are, but its impact reshaped the world. Imagine the uncertainty as a new monarch arrived, not through conquest but through invitation, under conditions that limited royal authority and expanded the role of Parliament. For the first time, the nation openly acknowledged that the king was not the ultimate source of law. The institutions themselves held that power, and those institutions were now influenced by a wider array of voices. The government no longer revolved around the preferences of a single ruler. It began to reflect the interests of a broader group, including merchants, inventors, and skilled workers whose ideas and ambitions would soon reshape society. With these changes came a shift in the emotional landscape of daily life. A craftsman could now invest in new tools without fearing arbitrary seizure. A merchant could plan long-term ventures without worrying that the crown would suddenly change the rules of trade. Innovators felt freer to experiment, and their curiosity began to ripple outward, sparking technological advances that would feed into the Industrial Revolution. For the first time, An economy had the space to grow not through extraction but through creativity. And as these new institutions settled into place, they carried forward a message that would echo far beyond England's borders. When more people share in decision-making, societies gain the unpredictable but powerful force of human innovation. This shift didn't guarantee fairness or prosperity overnight. But it cracked open a door that had been sealed for centuries, allowing the future to take shape in ways no ruler could control. The story now prepares to move from the streets of post-revolution England to the broader world shaped by this transformation, tracing the currents of innovation, conflict, and power that would lift some nations into unprecedented wealth while leaving others trapped under systems that feared change. As the effects of England's institutional shift settled into the fabric of society, the world around it began to feel the tremors. Streets that once echoed with the steady rhythm of familiar crafts now carried the sharper, more insistent sounds of experimentation. The glow from workshop windows stretched later into the night, fueled by the curiosity of men who believed their ideas might finally matter. In dimly lit rooms, inventors hammered, tinkered, failed, and tried again. What made their efforts extraordinary was not their genius alone but the simple, powerful protection that the new institutional order offered them. The knowledge that what they created would belong to them, not to a monarch or official who might seize it for personal gain. This shift in emotional security reshaped the ambitions of ordinary people. A young apprentice watching his master fashion a new tool felt something different stirring inside him, a sense that one day he might design his own. A merchant studying shipping records at a desk lit by candlelight believed he could take risks across distant seas without fearing sudden changes in royal policy. These quiet moments of personal confidence accumulated into something monumental. They laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution, not through a single breakthrough but through countless decisions made by people who finally felt safe enough to imagine, innovate, and invest in the unknown. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, societies remained caught in systems where power flowed through narrow channels. In these places, leaders feared the unpredictability of innovation. They worried that new ideas might disrupt the delicate balance of authority they relied on. A brilliant mechanic could attract unwanted attention. A successful trader could be perceived as a threat. In such environments, caution became the wiser companion. Ambition found itself wrapped tightly within the limits imposed by power. The emotional texture of life in these societies was filled with quiet calculations: how to stay out of trouble, how to avoid drawing the eye of officials, how to hold on to what little one had without being noticed. The contrast deepened in the way societies approached technology and progress. In parts of Europe influenced by more inclusive institutions, mechanical inventions began to spread like sparks carried by the wind. New weaving machines, steam-powered engines, and efficient tools emerged not from centralized commands but from the restless minds of people allowed to explore their ideas openly. These innovations transformed cities into bustling centers where factories roared with new energy, and railways snaked across the countryside, connecting communities in ways that felt almost magical. But in societies with extractive institutions, technological progress was often viewed with suspicion. Leaders asked themselves not whether an invention could improve lives, but whether it might disrupt their control. This fear found its clearest expression in places like the Ottoman Empire, where printing presses, capable of spreading knowledge at unprecedented speed, were seen not as tools of enlightenment but as threats to the established order. Centuries after Europe embraced printing, the empire still restricted it, slowing the spread of literacy and new ideas. The emotional cost of this decision was subtle but devastating. Generations grew up in a world where curiosity was filtered, where the light of knowledge flickered behind barriers designed to protect power rather than nurture growth. The narrative now shifts toward another striking example of how extractive systems can suffocate potential: the Spanish colonization of the Americas. Imagine a village high in the Andes, where the cold dawn air carries the faint metallic scent of distant silver mines. Indigenous communities awaken knowing that the wealth beneath their feet will never be theirs. Spanish administrators demanded labor through brutal systems of forced extraction, pulling young men from their families and thrusting them into mines where the air was thin and the danger constant. Life here revolved around the needs of the empire, not the hopes of the people who lived on this land. Unlike England, where institutions slowly bent toward protecting individual rights, the Spanish colonial model entrenched a hierarchy where the powerful extracted as much as possible from the labor of others. Innovation in these regions stagnated because no one felt safe enough to invest in new methods. Why improve a process when the reward would be seized by those who controlled the system? This created a long shadow that stretched far beyond the colonial era, leaving many countries in the Americas struggling with institutions that preserved inequality long after independence movements declared freedom. The deeper we look, the clearer the emotional truth becomes. When institutions choke the potential of individuals, societies lose the unpredictable brilliance that arises when people are allowed to think freely. When they protect instead of extract, they unlock the boundless creativity that drives nations forward. As the story turns toward the broader sweep of history, we begin to see that these institutional differences are not accidents, but the result of paths shaped by conflict, resistance, and the constant struggle over who gets to participate in the future. The narrative now moves to a powerful moment in history that reveals how deeply the architecture of institutions can shape a nation's destiny: the colonization of Africa. Picture a sprawling landscape of forests, savannas, and kingdoms, each with its own culture, its own rhythms, and its own evolving political structures. Long before European powers arrived, these societies had complex systems of governance. Some centralized, others decentralized, many balancing tradition with the needs of their people. Life unfolded according to local rules that made sense within the context of each community's history. But when European colonizers swept across the continent, they brought with them not only weapons and unfamiliar languages but a vision of institutions designed for extraction. Their goal was not to nurture local governance or create systems where people had a voice. It was to control the flow of resources, gold, ivory, rubber, land, and to do so with minimal resistance. To achieve this, they reshaped political structures to concentrate power in the hands of a few. In some regions, they elevated local leaders willing to cooperate. In others, they dismantled existing systems entirely, replacing them with distant authorities accountable only to imperial aims. Imagine the emotional shock felt by communities as foreign administrators imposed taxes payable only in currency that people had never used before, forcing them into colonial labor markets. Fields that once belonged to families for generations were claimed in the name of distant crowns. A farmer who had measured his wealth in cattle and community ties suddenly found his existence defined by rules he did not understand. Traditional leaders lost authority, not because their people rejected them, but because colonial laws stripped their power away. Lives became entangled in a system created to extract as much value as possible while offering little in return. The long-term consequences of this disruption were profound. Colonial institutions left behind fragmented political landscapes, where groups once connected by trade or shared tradition found themselves divided by borders drawn without regard for cultural or linguistic realities. In some areas, colonial rulers favored certain groups over others, creating deep fractures that would later erupt into conflict. When independence movements finally expelled colonial powers, many nations inherited institutions built on exploitation rather than inclusion. The emotional legacy of this history became woven into the structure of daily life. Systems where power often remained concentrated, where corruption found fertile ground, and where trust in government was fragile because citizens had been excluded from shaping it for generations. At the same time, the story examines how nations outside Europe struggled to industrialize under extractive institutions. Consider the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where leaders feared the rise of an empowered middle class. While factories existed, innovation moved slowly because political elites viewed economic progress as a threat to their authority. In Russia, the Tsarist regime resisted change even as pressure built from a growing population hungry for opportunity. Attempts at reform were cautious and incomplete, always overshadowed by the fear that too much openness might unravel the entire system. This reluctance to embrace inclusive institutions kept these societies locked in cycles of stagnation. People worked endlessly but saw little improvement in their lives. Those with ideas remained hesitant to voice them. And the emotional atmosphere became one of quiet disillusionment, a recognition that the world might be changing elsewhere, but here the walls of power resisted every push. As the narrative approaches its next movement, it becomes unmistakably clear that the rise and fall of nations cannot be understood without feeling the emotional weight of these institutional choices. They determine whose voice matters, whose future can expand, and whose potential is quietly smothered before it has a chance to bloom. The journey now prepares to move into the intricate relationship between political conflict, economic incentives, and the starkly different paths nations follow when they either embrace inclusion or cling to extraction. The story now moves into a deeper examination of how political power, once concentrated, resists change with a force that feels almost alive. Imagine a society where those at the top sit in grand halls decorated with symbols of authority, yet beneath the surface, their grip is held together by fear. Change, even when beneficial, threatens the foundation that keeps them elevated. Across history, whenever extractive elites sensed that new ideas might empower the many, they tightened their hold, as if bracing against an invisible tide that could sweep them away. This tension becomes clear as we follow societies trapped in cycles where innovation emerges but is swiftly suffocated. Picture an inventor in such a place, bent over a crude machine he has spent years refining. He knows it could transform production, save labor, and open doors to prosperity. Yet he also knows that presenting it to the world might attract the wrong kind of attention. Officials might claim it as their own, or accuse him of disrupting the established order. So he hesitates. The machine remains hidden beneath cloth, gathering dust while its creator weighs the cost of ambition. Multiply this fear across generations and a whole nation's potential begins to dim, not because its people lack creativity, but because its institutions punish those who dare to imagine more. The book brings this emotional reality to life through the story of the Black Death in medieval Europe. The plague devastated populations, sweeping through towns with terrifying speed. Families closed doors against neighbors, bells tolled endlessly, and fear spread as quickly as the disease itself. Yet in its aftermath, something unexpected happened. The massive decline in population gave surviving workers newfound bargaining power. Lords accustomed to unquestioned authority now faced labor shortages so severe they could no longer command obedience with the same force. Workers demanded better wages and mobility. Some fled to towns where they could build new lives beyond feudal control. In Western Europe, this shift disrupted the old order. As workers gained agency, elites were forced to make concessions. Institutions began, slowly and unevenly, to bend toward the interests of a broader population. But in Eastern Europe, elites responded differently. Terrified of losing their dominance, they pushed society toward harsher forms of serfdom. Laws restricted movement, wages were controlled, and those who tried to escape their obligations were hunted down. Instead of loosening their grip, the elites doubled down, creating a system where freedom narrowed even as the world changed around them. This divergence planted seeds that would grow into two very different futures. In the West, the growing power of merchants and workers nudged institutions toward inclusiveness. In the East, the reactionary tightening of control locked nations into extractive patterns that would take centuries to unwind. The emotional resonance of this moment is striking. Two regions facing the same catastrophe yet choosing opposite paths because of the way power was distributed. When elites feel secure enough to compromise, societies evolve. When they feel threatened, societies freeze. The narrative then draws us toward the Ottoman Empire, a place where rulers feared the military power of their own subjects. The Janissaries, once a disciplined fighting force loyal to the Sultan, gradually became a political faction with their own interests. As their influence grew, they began resisting innovations that might weaken their position. When European states modernized their armies with new weapons and tactics, the Ottomans hesitated. Leaders believed modernization would empower alternative factions, destabilizing the fragile balance that kept them in control. And so, reforms stalled and the empire gradually fell behind, not because of cultural deficiencies or a lack of intelligence, but because the institutions that guided political decisions were paralyzed by fear of change. This pattern echoes across centuries. When institutions protect narrow interests, even well-intentioned leaders find themselves trapped. Attempts at reform are blocked by those who fear losing their privileges. Economies stagnate, trust erodes, and people begin to internalize a quiet resignation, as if the possibility of progress were a distant dream. But in places where institutions allow power to shift, where new groups can rise without triggering panic among those already in charge, societies breathe with a different rhythm. Curiosity becomes safer. Innovation becomes welcomed. Progress becomes a shared endeavor rather than a threat. The story now turns toward one of the most dramatic institutional collapses of the modern era, the fall of the absolutist monarchy in France, where decades of inequality and frustration exploded into revolution, reshaping the future of Europe with a violent force that revealed just how fragile extractive systems truly are when pushed too far. Before the French Revolution erupted, life in France carried a tension that was felt even in its quietest corners. Walk through a bustling Paris market of the late 18th century and you would see a city rich in culture, ideas, and ambition. Yet beneath the lively noise, people whispered about heavy taxes, food shortages, and a ruling class that seemed insulated from the struggles of everyday life. The monarchy, surrounded by ornate halls and shimmering candlelight, lived in a world that felt distant from the cold kitchens and cramped rooms of common families. These two emotional realities, extravagance and deprivation, coexisted so long that the air itself seemed charged with the inevitability of collapse. The institutions of France at the time were deeply extractive. Nobles enjoyed privileges that placed them above common law. Wealth flowed upward, often extracted from farmers who barely scraped by. Promising minds were silenced or limited by social barriers that had nothing to do with talent. In this environment, frustration simmered. The people were not simply angry at taxes or hunger, they felt invisible within a system designed to ignore their voices. And when institutions refuse to evolve, pressure builds until something breaks. The break came with a force that stunned the world. Streets that once carried ordinary routines now filled with crowds demanding change. The storming of the Bastille was not just the fall of a prison. It was the emotional eruption of a society refusing to remain silent. But the revolution also revealed the darker truth about extractive systems. When they collapse, they often leave behind chaos. Old powers crumble quickly, but the vacuum they leave is difficult to fill. France endured cycles of hope and terror as different groups battled for control, each trying to define what the new institutions should look like. The revolution's emotional arc is a reminder that institutions shape not only economies but the very psychology of nations. When systems exclude people for too long, the demand for inclusion can burst forth with overwhelming intensity. And while the French Revolution eventually led to more representative institutions, the journey was violent and fragmented, showing how tumultuous the path toward inclusiveness can be when elites cling to power until the last possible moment. Contrast this with England's earlier, slower transformation, where repeated conflicts gradually diffused power instead of destroying the system entirely. The comparison reveals an important truth. Inclusive institutions often emerge not from idealism but from a delicate balance between pressure and compromise. When pressure is ignored, compromise becomes impossible. The narrative now moves to a different but equally revealing example, the United States. From its earliest days, America displayed characteristics of inclusive institutions, broad property rights, political participation, and legal protections that encouraged innovation. Walk through a small American town in the 19th century, and you would feel the atmosphere of restless ambition. Farmers experimented with new crops, inventors tinkered in sheds, small factories hummed with activity. There was a belief, imperfect but powerful, that effort could shape destiny. But the story does not ignore the darker contradictions. Slavery, deeply extractive and brutally enforced, coexisted alongside these inclusive institutions. Enslaved people lived under total control, denied autonomy, rights, and the fruits of their labor. This contradiction carved a deep wound into the emotional and institutional core of the nation. The Civil War became the violent reckoning forced by a system trying to expand inclusive rights while holding on to an extractive regime. After the war, the promise of inclusion flickered with uncertainty. Reconstruction offered hope but was crushed by new systems of disenfranchisement, leaving a legacy that would shape American institutions for generations. Despite these contradictions, the United States continued to develop structures that encouraged broad participation. Land grants, schooling, and legal protections nurtured an environment where creativity could flourish. Immigrants arriving with little more than a few belongings felt the pull of possibility, something fundamentally different from what extractive systems offered. Even so, the emotional landscape remained uneven, marked by struggles between expanding rights and forces resisting change. As the narrative approaches its next movement, the focus turns to the subtle yet powerful loops that form when institutions and economic incentives feed into each other. Inclusive systems generate growth, and growth strengthens inclusive systems. Extractive systems generate stagnation, and stagnation strengthens extraction. These loops form the hidden tides that pull nations forward or hold them in place, shaping destinies over centuries. The story now travels into the heart of the feedback loops that determine whether nations rise or falter, loops that operate quietly beneath the surface of daily life. Imagine a society where inclusive institutions have taken root. People feel secure enough to invest in new ideas, and those ideas begin to reshape the economy. As prosperity grows, more individuals gain influence and demand a voice in shaping the future. Their participation strengthens the very institutions that protect opportunity, creating a cycle where inclusion fuels growth, and growth reinforces inclusion. It is not a perfect path. There are setbacks, conflicts, and moments of tension. But the overall direction moves forward because people can imagine their future widening, not shrinking. Now picture the opposite, a society locked in extraction. Power remains in the hands of a small elite who view new wealth as something to capture rather than cultivate. When resources appear, whether through minerals, trade, or foreign investment, elites find ways to direct the benefits toward themselves. The people who produce this wealth see little return, and their incentives wither. Innovation becomes riskier than obedience. Talented individuals stay silent or emigrate. As the economy stagnates, elites tighten their control even further, convinced that any loosening might unravel the fragile system that benefits them. The stagnation deepens. The institutions grow even more extractive. And the loop continues generation after generation. One of the book's most vivid examples of this trap unfolds in Latin America, where colonial structures planted centuries earlier continued to echo long after independence. Even as new nations raised flags and declared freedom, the old institutional logic remained. Land elites maintained control over vast estates, political systems favored those with influence, and ordinary people found themselves locked out of meaningful participation. It was not that these societies lacked brilliance or ambition, far from it. Rather, their institutions made upward mobility a rare exception instead of a possibility accessible to all. When effort goes unrewarded, people learn to protect themselves rather than innovate. And when they retreat into survival mode, nations lose the collective spark needed to grow. In contrast, the United States, despite its contradictions and internal conflicts, benefited from a foundational set of institutions that distributed power more broadly. Its open political culture, competitive economic environment, and relative ease of social mobility created conditions where countless individuals felt permitted to try. Some failed, many struggled, but the idea that effort could yield opportunity became part of the nation's emotional landscape. This difference was not about moral superiority or cultural uniqueness. It was about the structure of incentives. When institutions reward initiative, societies shift from caution to curiosity. When they punish it, ambition folds inward. The book travels next to a powerful illustration of institutional divergence in a place where the consequences remain starkly visible: the city of Buenos Aires in Argentina. Imagine the elegant facades along the wide avenues, remnants of an era when Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world. A century ago, the nation's economy rivaled those of the most prosperous European powers. Its farmlands were fertile, its exports booming, its cities buzzing with cultural energy. But while the economy flourished, political institutions remained concentrated in the hands of elites who viewed government not as a mechanism for broad participation but as a tool for maintaining privilege. Over time, instability grew. Short-term policies replaced long-term vision. Governments changed frequently, each swinging between competing interests. Property rights, at times protected, at times threatened, left investors wary. The emotional atmosphere shifted from optimism to uncertainty. People could no longer predict whether rules would remain stable long enough for their plans to take shape. As confidence eroded, the foundations of growth weakened, demonstrating how rapidly an extractive tilt can undo decades of progress. Argentina's story reminds us that wealth alone cannot sustain a nation. Without inclusive institutions, prosperity becomes fragile, vulnerable to the whims of political turbulence. This fragility stands in stark contrast to nations that embraced inclusiveness at critical moments. Consider Australia, where the discovery of gold sparked a wave of migration in the 19th century. Instead of allowing elites to control the newfound wealth, miners and settlers demanded political representation, insisting that the institutions of the colony reflect the principles of fairness and opportunity. Their resistance shaped the political structure of the emerging nation, ensuring that rights expanded rather than narrowed. The emotional tone of this history feels different from that of many extractive societies. Instead of resignation, there is assertiveness. Instead of silence, there is an insistence on being heard. The narrative then turns toward another powerful example of this institutional divide: the divergent paths of Egypt and South Korea. Both nations faced poverty in the mid-20th century, yet their trajectories split sharply. South Korea embraced reforms that broadened participation and encouraged education, gradually allowing innovation to shape its economy. Egypt, under the weight of centralized control and entrenched elites, struggled to create space for new voices. Entrepreneurs faced barriers that discouraged risk-taking. Investments favored the politically connected. And the emotional atmosphere became one where people learned to navigate the system not by contributing new ideas, but by attaching themselves to existing power networks. The journey now prepares to explore what happens when extractive systems are confronted by institutional drift, the phenomenon where elites face pressure to reform but attempt to twist new opportunities to their advantage. It is here, in this delicate struggle between reform and resistance, that the next chapter of nations' destinies unfolds. As the narrative moves deeper into the mechanics of institutional drift, we enter a world where powerful elites sense the winds of change and try to reshape them without loosening their grip. This moment is delicate, almost cinematic in its tension. Picture a nation where pressure is rising from below. Young people demand jobs, skilled workers demand rights, and an emerging middle class begins to challenge old hierarchies. The leaders hear the voices, feel the unrest, and understand that refusing all reform might spark upheaval. Yet they fear that too much openness could end their dominance. So they search for a narrow path, a way to appear modern while keeping real power concentrated. This dynamic plays out vividly in many countries attempting to industrialize under extractive systems. A factory might be permitted, but only if it is owned by someone connected to the ruling elite. A new school might open, but the curriculum is shaped to maintain loyalty rather than foster critical thinking. A new law might promise equality, yet its enforcement remains selective. These half measures create an illusion of progress, but the emotional reality felt by the population remains unchanged. People know when reforms are genuine and when they are merely performances designed to quiet discontent. Nowhere is this tension more poignantly illustrated than in the story of the Soviet Union. In the decades after its creation, state control shaped every aspect of life. Heavy industry grew rapidly under centralized planning, and at moments it seemed as if the system might compete with the West. But beneath the surface, fear dominated. Innovation was dangerous because any deviation from approved ideas could be interpreted as dissent. A scientist pursuing a new technology had to worry not only about scientific challenges but about political interpretations of his work. If his research contradicted official ideology, his career, or even his freedom, could vanish in an instant. This fear became a silent but powerful force that froze progress. Laboratories, factories, and offices were filled with intelligent, capable people who learned to stay within the boundaries set by the state. The emotional cost of this containment was immense. Entire generations grew up knowing that brilliance could be punished. The economy stagnated because the system was designed not to encourage creativity but to enforce conformity. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, the world saw the consequences of decades spent suppressing the potential of millions. In China, a different path unfolded. After decades of turmoil, the country began introducing market-oriented reforms. But unlike the Soviet leadership, Chinese elites found a way to maintain political control while allowing selective economic freedom. Factories opened, foreign investment poured in, and people gained room to innovate. Yet political participation remained tightly controlled. The result was a hybrid system, partially inclusive in economic terms, extractive in political terms. This balance generated rapid growth, but it also created tensions that continue to shape the emotional and institutional atmosphere of the nation. People can build wealth, but they cannot fully challenge the political structure that governs their lives. The book also guides us into the emotional landscape of nations burdened by resource wealth, a paradox known as the resource curse. Imagine a small country discovering oil beneath its soil. For a moment, the future seems bright. But when wealth arrives suddenly, elites often move quickly to capture it. Instead of using the revenue to build schools, infrastructure, or inclusive institutions, they treat it as private income. The population watches pipelines and cargo ships carry away fortunes while their own opportunities remain limited. Over time, the emotional climate shifts from excitement to bitterness. Citizens understand that their country is rich, yet their lives remain precarious. And because the state relies on resource revenue instead of taxation, leaders feel little pressure to be accountable. Countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Venezuela exemplify this pattern. Despite immense natural wealth, their institutions remained extractive, and the benefits flowed upward. Economic volatility became a constant companion, with boom periods followed by devastating collapse. The emotional weight of these cycles is heavy. Families rise briefly on waves of optimism only to be pulled back into uncertainty when prices fall. As the narrative approaches its next movement, it prepares to confront one of the book's central insights, that nations fail not because of geography or culture, but because those with power choose to structure society in ways that protect themselves at the cost of everyone else. And when those choices persist long enough, they create a future where the human spirit itself must fight to breathe. The story now moves into one of the most striking truths of national development. Even when societies stand on the edge of transformation, the people who hold power often fight hardest to prevent it. Their resistance does not come from ignorance but from fear. Fear that a more open world would unravel the privileges they have woven around themselves. Picture a hallway in a government building where decisions are being made behind heavy wooden doors. Outside, the air hums with the quiet restlessness of citizens hoping for change. Inside, elites discuss reforms with guarded voices, weighing how much openness they can allow without losing control. Their hesitation shapes the destiny of millions. This conflict between pressure for progress and fear of losing power becomes painfully clear in nations like Sierra Leone, where the discovery of diamonds created a rush of interest from global markets. Yet instead of using this wealth to build inclusive systems, elites saw an opportunity to strengthen their own rule. Competition for control over diamond-rich regions fueled corruption and violence. Instead of schools and hospitals, armed factions grew stronger. Communities caught in the middle faced instability that seeped into every part of life. The uncertainty of whether crops would be safe, whether children could walk to school, whether life tomorrow would resemble life today. Here, extractive institutions did not merely stagnate progress, they actively fed conflict. Zimbabwe offers another emotional layer to this pattern. After independence, the country held immense potential. Its land was fertile, its people educated, its economy relatively strong. But as political leaders consolidated power, they used institutions not to distribute opportunity but to secure loyalty. Farmland was seized and handed to allies regardless of expertise. Elections carried the shadow of intimidation. As economic conditions worsened, the emotional climate changed from hope to quiet fear. Families who once saw a future in their homeland began to leave. Shops closed. Currency lost its meaning. All because institutions designed to serve the people were twisted into instruments serving the few. These stories reveal a deeper truth. Extractive systems are not static. They often become more intense over time because elites, sensing growing dissatisfaction below, tighten their grip. The atmosphere in such societies takes on a heavy stillness, as if every citizen carries a quiet calculation: how to stay safe, how to avoid drawing attention, how to navigate rules that shift according to the needs of those above. Yet the book does not treat this dynamic as destiny. It shows moments when societies found unexpected pathways toward inclusiveness, moments where the emotional pulse of a nation changed because ordinary people pushed back. This shift becomes vivid when the narrative turns to the civil rights movement in the United States. Walk through a southern town in the 1950s, and you would feel the tension in the air, a separation of rights enforced not just by law but by deeply rooted social norms. Public spaces, schools, and services were divided. Black Americans lived with constant reminders that the system was built to limit their potential. But even in the face of violence and intimidation, voices rose. Marches formed. Freedom riders crossed states with the knowledge that danger surrounded them. The emotional power of their determination reshaped the nation's institutions, expanding rights that had long been denied. Similar patterns unfold across the world. In Botswana, leaders after independence chose a path of inclusion even though they faced the same temptations as other post-colonial states. Instead of hoarding power, they strengthened democratic institutions, encouraged participation, and managed natural resources with transparency. The emotional atmosphere of the young nation reflected this choice. Citizens felt ownership of the system, and that trust created room for growth. The contrast between Botswana and other resource-rich African nations became a powerful illustration of how leadership choices, guided by institutional incentives, shape futures. But perhaps the most illuminating emotional arc comes from a place like China during the late 20th century. As the country opened economically, millions moved from rural villages to cities, drawn by the promise of opportunity. Streets once quiet became alive with neon signs, crowded buses, and markets overflowing with energy. The country transformed at astonishing speed, yet political control remained centralized. People learned to navigate this dual reality, expanding personal freedom and economic life while remaining cautious in political expression. Their experiences capture the complex tension of living within a system that encourages innovation but limits voice. The future feels open in some directions and sealed in others. The narrative now shifts toward the final core insight of the book. The fate of nations is not written in their culture, geography, or DNA. It is written in the institutions they build, and in the emotional world those institutions create within their people. As the story approaches its closing movements, it prepares to explore the fragile balance between freedom and control, innovation and fear, opportunity and exclusion, revealing that the struggle over institutions is ultimately the struggle over human potential itself. The emotional weight of institutional choices becomes even clearer as the narrative brings us into environments where success seems possible but continually slips away. Consider a country blessed with fertile farmland, valuable minerals, and a population eager to work. At first glance, such a place appears destined for prosperity. But when power remains concentrated, every attempt at growth becomes tangled in struggles for control. Imagine a farmer who improves his harvest through careful innovation. New irrigation, better seeds, smarter rotations. His success catches the attention of local authorities who demand higher fees, new permits, or special favors. Soon, the farmer realizes that excellence is not rewarded but punished. He scales back his effort, protecting himself from scrutiny. Multiply this across a nation, and the quiet withdrawal of ambition becomes a collective tragedy. The book illustrates this emotional reality through the story of Colombia. Its mountains hold vast resources, its cities pulse with entrepreneurial energy, yet for decades the country struggled under the weight of conflict and institutional fragility. Armed groups competed for territory, and corruption crept into political systems. Ordinary citizens lived within layers of uncertainty, unsure whether their land titles would be honored, whether their businesses would be safe, whether the laws would apply fairly. This uncertainty became a barrier as real as any physical wall. Even the brightest ideas dim when surrounded by unpredictability. Contrast this with Japan, a nation that embraced a very different institutional path following the Meiji Restoration. After centuries of isolation, Japan opened its doors to the world with a remarkable combination of ambition and strategy. Leaders traveled abroad, studying institutions that had propelled other nations forward. When they returned, they introduced new structures, modern schools, updated legal systems, industrial policies, that enabled rapid growth. The emotional atmosphere of the nation shifted. A farmer could imagine his children becoming engineers. A blacksmith could envision opening a factory. Communities began to see the future not as a distant dream but as a landscape they could shape. This collective optimism became the emotional engine of Japan's transformation. As the story unfolds, one truth grows increasingly clear. Inclusive institutions generate hope. Not blind optimism but a grounded sense that effort can lead somewhere meaningful. This hope spreads through families, workplaces, and communities, building an emotional resilience that sustains development even during difficult periods. Extractive institutions, by contrast, produce resignation. People adapt to the limits placed around them, often finding ingenious ways to survive, but rarely feeling empowered to shape the future. The narrative now moves toward the interplay between globalization and institutions. Some believe that global markets alone could lift nations out of poverty. Yet without inclusive systems, globalization often deepens inequality. Wealth generated through trade becomes concentrated in the hands of those who already hold power. Factories rise but their profits flow to elites. Workers remain vulnerable. The emotional promise of globalization, connection, opportunity, progress, fades into frustration when institutions fail to translate global growth into local well-being. This tension becomes visible in countries like Mexico, where proximity to the United States created opportunities for trade but did not fundamentally reshape the institutional foundations inherited from centuries of extractive rule. While some regions thrived, others remained trapped in cycles of inequality and corruption. Citizens witnessed moments of progress, yet the emotional undercurrent was mixed, hope tempered by the fear that systemic barriers would limit how far they could rise. The story then turns toward the Middle East, where vast oil reserves created immense wealth but little inclusiveness. In nations where rulers relied on oil revenue instead of taxation, the social contract shifted. Because leaders did not depend on citizens for revenue, they felt less compelled to share power or be accountable. Jobs were distributed through patronage networks. Innovation was confined within rigid boundaries. People lived in landscapes shimmering with wealth yet felt their own futures suspended, disconnected from the resources beneath their feet. The emotional dissonance of living in a rich nation without opportunity is one of the most profound consequences of extractive institutions. As we near the final movement, the narrative prepares to draw all these threads together. The emotional landscapes of hope and fear, the institutional choices that shape destinies, and the universal human desire for a life where effort is rewarded rather than suppressed. The story approaches its final reflections, where it reveals the fundamental insight at the heart of everything. Institutions do not just determine national prosperity, they determine the emotional climate in which people live, dream, and build their futures. The journey now comes to its final arc, where the threads of history, emotion, power, and human aspiration converge into a single, quiet truth. Not a dramatic revelation but a steady, resonant one, the kind that feels as if it has been whispering beneath every scene we've walked through. Imagine looking back at the landscapes we visited, the divided streets of Nogales, the shadowed fields of extractive empires, the bustling workshops of early industrial England, the trembling squares of revolutionary France, the hopeful towns of Botswana, the restless streets of modern China. Each place carries its own texture, its own rhythms, its own emotional imprint. Yet beneath all of them lies the same structural heartbeat, the institutions that define whose voice matters and whose potential finds room to unfold. In this final stretch, the narrative moves gently through the emotional consequences of these structures. Consider a young child growing up in a society with inclusive institutions. Her path is not guaranteed, but it expands with each step. She sees adults around her building businesses, solving problems, arguing in councils, challenging decisions without fear of punishment. She watches neighbors improve their homes, sees teachers encourage curiosity, feels a sense that effort shapes possibility. Even the air seems to move differently, lighter, as if anticipation is woven into daily life. She grows up believing that the world is not predetermined, that her voice carries weight, that her life can be more tomorrow than it is today. Now imagine another child in a society where power is tightly held. He learns early that decisions are made elsewhere, often behind closed doors. He sees his parents tread carefully, their words filtered before they reach the air. He notices how people survive by aligning with the powerful, not by nurturing their ideas. His world feels narrower. Not hopeless, but confined, shaped by rules designed to keep him within boundaries he did not choose. And over time he internalizes those limits just as generations before him did. The quiet tragedy of extractive institutions is not only the poverty they create but the imagination they steal. When the future feels sealed, ambition folds inward. And when ambition folds, a nation's heartbeat slows. These two emotional worlds form the essence of why nations rise or fall. The book does not claim that inclusive institutions promise perfection. They do not erase inequality or shield societies from conflict. But they do something essential. They allow the unpredictable force of human creativity to spread. They let ideas come from unexpected places. They protect people who take risks. They build trust that the rules will not shift overnight to favor someone in the shadows. And in this atmosphere, nations grow, not because of natural resources or geographic luck, but because millions of individuals wake up with the belief that tomorrow can be different. As the narrative moves deeper into its reflection, it becomes clear that no nation's path is fixed. History is filled with transformative moments when the trajectory could have shifted. Moments when elites could have embraced openness instead of fear, when societies could have strengthened institutions instead of retreating into old patterns. These moments often arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary debates, policy reforms, or elections. Sometimes they explode into revolutions. Other times they unfold through negotiations that reshape the boundaries of authority. But always, beneath these turning points, lies the struggle over who participates in shaping the future. Consider South Korea again, a country once devastated by war, its cities reduced to rubble, its people facing hunger and hardship. Few could have predicted its transformation. Yet through a series of institutional reforms, investments in education, gradual openings to participation, and a population unwilling to accept stagnation, it shifted from extraction to inclusion. The emotional atmosphere changed from survival to aspiration. Factories rose, universities expanded, families sent their children into new fields of study. A nation once struggling for breath found a rhythm of possibility. Contrast this with places where extractive institutions hardened. In North Korea, power concentrated so tightly that even small acts of self-expression became dangerous. People learned to speak carefully, to hide their thoughts, to live with the constant weight of surveillance. Innovation could not breathe in such an atmosphere. The emotional landscape here is one of endurance rather than opportunity. Yet the book never suggests that inclusive institutions are guaranteed to last. They require constant pressure from below, constant vigilance against concentration of power, constant reshaping as societies evolve. Even nations that rose through inclusiveness can drift if complacency sets in. Institutions are not monuments carved in stone. They are living structures that reflect the ongoing negotiation between freedom and control, cooperation and dominance, hope and fear. And so, the narrative reaches its final emotional insight. Nations fail when people are denied the space to imagine. When the system rewards obedience over creativity, silence over participation, extraction over innovation, the spark that drives societies forward begins to fade. Prosperity becomes fragile. Trust erodes. The human spirit bends under the weight of stagnation. But nations thrive when people feel their ideas can travel beyond the walls of their homes. When the rules protect them instead of trapping them. When effort becomes a bridge rather than a burden. In such places, the future becomes a shared creation, shaped not by a select few but by millions of voices rising in the same direction. As the final scenes of this long narrative settle, imagine standing again at the invisible line where two worlds meet, one shaped by inclusion, the other by extraction. The soil beneath your feet is the same. The sun warms both sides. The difference lies in what people are allowed to dream, in how power flows, in whether a child grows up believing her life belongs to her. That is the quiet, profound truth at the center of this journey. The fate of nations begins in the unseen architecture of their institutions and lives in the hearts of the people who must navigate them. And as long as societies continue to fight for the right to imagine a wider future, the possibility of rising remains alive, carried forward not by destiny, but by the human desire to breathe freely, to create boldly, and to shape a life that stretches beyond the limits of yesterday.